So in the last lecture, we created this new project structure. Let's now start filling the cockpit and persons.js file with some life. I'll start with persons. And persons can be a functional component here, because I don't plan on managing state in here, though with React hooks we could of course do that theoretically. But I'll keep that structure where we use class-based components for state management and functional components for the presentation of content. So therefore here I'll go with a functional component. That will never be wrong. So what I will do is I will again create a constant, persons, which is just a function in the end. A function that will receive props though. Now here's another way we can write this function body though. Thus far we always simply return something there. Now we can definitely do that. But if we only want to return something in that function body, due to our project setup and all the ES6 features we can use, or the next gen features in general we can shorten this to just return parentheses. Now this is simply due to the way arrow functions work. If you write them in one line, and this by the way does not mean that you can't split the part inside the parentheses across multiple lines, but you start with that in the same line. If you only have that one line and not multiple lines as a function body, you can simply start with the return statement. And if you return parentheses, this is what we got here, since you omit the return statement in this one line notation. So that's the default ES6 arrow function notation. If it's in one line, this automatically gets returned and you can hence omit the return statement. Now in here, you directly put your JSX code. Now this is not everything. We of course also have to import React as before. And now we know that props will contain an array of persons which we want to transform into an array of JSX elements, just as we did in app.js. So we can basically copy the code from there. The persons map code here, where we map our array into an array of persons. I'll copy this code. We still will need to adjust it though, but this will be relatively easy. So in persons.js, here inside my parentheses, I will call persons map though on the props persons map. And now here keep in mind, we're already writing JSX. So we can even omit the parentheses here because we're not having a JSX expression here. This is normal JavaScript after all. It will contain JSX in the inside, but that doesn't change the fact that props persons map is normal JavaScript code we're calling. So with that, we're now returning person here. And we need to import that person component. So import person from /person person, pointing to the person.js file. With that, we got a very short and concise way of writing this. We got our persons, which we expect to receive on our props, and then we still map persons, this array, into an array of JSX elements. Now, one thing we still need to do is we need to adjust our click and changed handler, because this delete person handler and this name changed handler, that won't work anymore because we no longer have these methods here. We no longer have a class here. This is just a function. Of course, we could create a class here and handle the deletion and so on here, but keep in mind that this should typically be handled in a couple of or very few containers and not in all your components. So the way to handle this would be to not call this, but props delete person handler and props. Though again, not delete person handler, but more likely the name of the property we want to use, like props clicked and maybe props changed. With these changes in place, let's export our persons function here. So export default persons and make sure to save all files. Now let's go back to the app.js file. There we no longer need this code, of course. Instead, what we do need here is we simply need to reach out to our persons component. So let's add this import persons from persons/persons. This is our new import path pointing to the persons.js file in the persons folder. With that, we can use persons like this here And now we need to pass 3 pieces of information to that component. The 3 props we're using: the person's prop, the clicked prop, and the changed prop. These are the 3 props we're accessing. Person name, age, and key, that doesn't really matter because that is the individual person from the persons array we're looping through. So we only need props, persons, clicked, and changed. Back in app.js, we should pass that. Persons simply is this state persons. Let me split this over multiple lines to make it easier to read. Clicked should pass a reference to the function we want to execute when this is fired from the persons component. So here, this will be this delete person handler. And changed, that will be this name changed handler. Now let's see if that works as it should. We can now remove that old code down there. All we have here is our persons component, which will render the list, and we still conditionally show it or don't show it. Make sure all files are saved, and let's reload our application, make sure npm start is still running, and toggle the persons. And this looks pretty good. We can still work with it as we did before. But now if we use the React developer tools and dive into that, you see we indeed got our persons component here with our individual person, or if we reload, of course, with all our persons, these 3. So it's working as before, but we improved the structure a little bit because now in the app container, we don't have to worry about the logic of creating that list. We outsource this to the persons.js file, and it is the best practice to create granular pieces where each component has a clear focus. Now the same goes for the cockpit. There, we also want to outsource the logic into the cockpit.js file. And for the cockpit, we basically need to put the h1 tag, the paragraph, and the button into its own component. So we can simply do that by going into the cockpit.js file. And there again, this will be a functional component here. We could manage state in there anyways with use state, but I'll not even do that because in this component I don't want to manage any state. Still following that best practice of using as many functional components as possible. So here this will be the cockpit constant, which is just an arrow function where we simply return some JSX maybe. Though there I will probably need more logic due to this styling of the button, so we can return a normal function body inside of which we return our JSX. We will also receive props here, and as always we need to import React from React to be able to really render JSX. And finally we will export our cockpit as the default. Now what should go in there? Let's go back to that app.js file. I already mentioned it's basically this JSX code which should go into our cockpit. So let's cut it here and let's move it into this return statement here in the cockpit. Now as you see, this of course throws an error because here we return multiple elements without a root node, and this is not supported here. Now we will dive into ways of supporting this in the next lectures. For now, let's simply wrap it into a div. But again, we will find other ways of not having to use this div over the next lectures because React 16 offers us alternatives. By the way, we already see one alternative in persons. There we return a list, and of course this means that we have multiple person objects sitting next to each other. There is no wrapping div. But this is okay for React 16. This is a feature which is supported. If you return a list, that is okay. You just may not hard code elements next to each other. So we will fix this too in the next lecture though, but for now let's go with that. And of course we got this assigned classes thing here in the cockpit where we manage the CSS classes this paragraph should have and the CSS class this button should have. We get the code for this in the app.js file. There we now need to grab the code, like const assign classes, where we take the person's length into account. Let's cut it from app.js and move it into our cockpit function here. There we of course access the state, and this won't work. So we should expect to get persons as props on our cockpit element. Now classes here needs to be imported. So we need a cockpit.css file. And in there, I will simply store the classes I'm using, red and bold, and my app button classes here. I will move them into the cockpit, but this app class here no longer is correct. Instead, this should be cockpit probably, because we no longer will nest this below this app class. The app class belongs to the app container, and due to component scoping, if we were to reference app here in a different component, this would not be the same automatically created unique identifier, so it wouldn't work. We need to create a custom class for this component which we use. So with that, we got these CSS classes added here. We of course need to add that import to that file too. So import classes from /cockpit CSS. And with that, we can use classes here again. We also should create a root class here, class name, which can be classes.cockpit. And with that, we should get scoping of our classes in the cockpit component again. We still need to set up this button class here. So back in the app.js file, here we're switching button class conditionally depending on whether we show persons or not. We'll have to put this logic into our cockpit component and also put the declaration of the button class there. So let's remove it from the app.js file and let's move it in there. Here I will store my red class assignment temporarily and set up button class to be empty at the beginning. Now, this will become important again for switching or for adding this red class to the button and hence setting the appropriate styling. Now with that, we have to add this check whether we want to add the red class to the button. So we can simply do this by checking if props, and then we should expect to get this show persons information. So if props show person, if that's the case, then we should execute this class or add this class, basically set this class. So now if we analyze this, we expect to get properties defining whether we're showing persons and the persons. Maybe we could even just get the person's length, but that's totally up to you. So for now, I will simply go with the whole persons array, which I expect. We should implement the cockpit component in the app.js file appropriately. So in app.js, which got a lot leaner, we now want to use our cockpit component, cockpit. For that, we first of all need to add the import. So let's quickly do that. Let's import cockpit with a capital C as for all custom components from the components folder, and there from the cockpit subfolder and from the cockpit.js file without the file extension as always. Now we can use cockpit, and we're doing so down here. And now I mentioned we expect two props there. Show persons is one, and this should simply be this state show persons, and the other one is the persons array itself. Let me split this over multiple lines to make it easier to read. The persons property should be this state persons. Now with that, we got a clearly focused app.js file with the cockpit and our persons array. We can now even clean this up a bit more by removing this wrapping div around the persons array. We don't need that. We can just return persons like this. It's one component which renders the list. So we cleaned this up even a bit more. And beyond that, we only got our handlers, our functions here, which manipulate the state. And that's exactly the idea behind such a container. It manages the state, it manipulates the state. Make sure all files are saved. And let's now see if this still works. If we reload, we got the toggle persons button, but it's not working. I know why, because one prop was forgotten. When we click this button on click, we try to execute this toggle persons handler. This of course doesn't work. We don't have this method here. We're not in a class here, we're in a function. So here we probably want to execute props clicked, and then in our app.js file on our cockpit component, We want to provide this prop, clicked, which we just defined, and there execute toggle person's handler. Now with that, we should have a working button again, and we do. We can toggle this, you see it gets the right styling, and everything works as before. But now we got a much better structure with clearly focused components, and this is actually how you should compose and create your React application. You should have clear responsibilities of your components, have them narrowly focused, create granular components, use as many functional components as possible, and have your containers be as lean as possible when it comes to JSX and styling. Some containers might not even have a style file because they only import other components which then do the styling. So this is a very lean setup here, which allows us to have a flexible and maintainable application.